Thanks to my Ko-fi supporters that make these videos possible. You can also get a deck review on my weekly Tuesday and Sunday streams. It's the best way to support the channel.
Hello everyone! Did you know that you have two hands in Magic the Gathering? Your regular hand and your second hand, called the Graveyard by some players. This video is all about using that second hand to its full potential and how to avoid graveyard hate sending you directly to gay baby jail while you do so. Now, there's a lot of different flavors of graveyard deck. It's really hard to encapsulate what kind of graveyard synergy you'll be looking for without knowing your deck's genotype. So let's go over some of the dominant strategies you'll find that concern themselves greatly with the graveyard. First, and most obviously in my opinion, is Reanimator decks. These lists try to get a giant idiot in the graveyard and then use cheap spells that return creatures from the graveyard into play. Aristocrats is another flavor of graveyard deck, which will often use small creatures that come back from the bin to synergize with on-creature death effects. What's more valuable about this line of gameplay for an Aristocrats deck versus a more token-based one is that there's a lot of on-death triggers that discriminate against token creatures. Lands decks are also tried and true graveyard decks. Shifting Woodland, Aftermath Analysty, Splendid Reclamation plays, Life from the Loam, Petrified Field, and just so many Crucible of World effects. Land gamers can just recur about anything. There are also some slow burn value over time graveyard decks. One that uses regrowth effects like actual regrowth, or more unfairly a card like Six or Shigeki Jukai Visionary. Flicker decks, too, often surprisingly touch the graveyard with Archaeomancers or Eternal Witnesses in this way, which combo with board-wide flicker spells or Ephemerate and Saw in Half, but they are not hinging on it most of the time. There's also a slew of graveyard combo decks. Storm with Past and Flame style cards, Yawgmoth Undying loops, Underworld Breach combos at higher power levels, all popular combos that utilize the graveyard in some way. Most decks are in fact able to use the graveyard in ways you don't expect here. And so let's talk about how to identify which of these archetypes you fall into and how to best set up your dumb graveyard cheatery. Despite that list sounding hectic and all over the place, and like it is, you're 100% right, and it could be worse. Like I could sit here all video and list off graveyard synergies, but that wouldn't be really all that helpful, would it? Here's the helpful piece of advice. Any graveyard deck can be divided into two camps, cheating and annoying. Reanimator, cheating. Slow burn value over time, annoying. Lands, it's an even split cheating or annoying. Aristocrats, annoying. But Aristocrats with a combo, now it's cheating. It's a classic dichotomy of fair and unfair decks. You see, in other formats, there's this concept of fair and unfair. Unfair decks don't really concern themselves with the board and try to go for an explosive player combo. Reanimator, Storm, all that are unfair decks for this reason. They explode the game with ruthless efficiency and favor speed over stability. Vice versa. A fair deck will take its time to do things, but in turn, they get better consistency with their games, but will often lose the speed game. We find this dichotomy reflected very well in graveyard-focused strategies, and it's often what I find to be the root problem a lot of people face on my deck building streams, when it comes to lists that want a graveyard element as its main game plan. Players don't know about this divide, and end up giving what should be an unfairly built deck a fairly built chassis, or vice versa, giving a fair deck the same concern for speed an unfair deck would crave. The number one culprit I see with this issue is Reanimator. Bracket 3 gamers and above, attention please. Reanimator sucks. You are 3v1ing a table on the get-go because you're a cheater deck. Yes, its ceiling is super high. That's not what I mean when I say it sucks. Of course, turn 2 Valgavoth Terror Eater is great. The point is that as a Reanimator deck, you are made up of 3 different parts. Big monsters, enablers, and reanimates. A, B, and C. And if you don't draw all 3 of these, then you are screwed. Now, there are cards like Entomb, Buried Alive, or Vile Entomber that make it an easy A-B combo, but now you need to find a reanimate. And listen, all I'm trying to say is that you need to lean into this archetype hard if you're going to do it. Otherwise, you are going to be screwed. Because here's the thing, my Reanimator deck does all those graveyard tutors to make it easier, and it can still have water treading games. So, that being said, I want you to guess how many Stitcher Suppliers, Quag Feasts, Barogoyfs, or other mill engines I'm running in that Reanimator deck to make it consistent. 0. This deck is primarily discard focused. Pack Weapon, Blood Token off Pointed Discussion, Bone Shards, you get the idea. The issue with mill in most decks like this is that you have to get lucky and hit one of the 4 or 5 giant monsters you run off the top, and if you ever draw one, you're stranded with it in hand with no way to ditch it.
Now, there are exceptions to this rule, like a deck built around Colossal Grave Reaver as your reanimate target should probably be loaded with mill. But generally speaking, if you want to increase your odds of putting a giant thing in the graveyard and then pulling that giant thing out every game, avoid mill engines and run discard spells and entombs instead. Now, those mill engines are better served in something slower and more grindy like a deck using Oversold Cemetery or Six. I want you to compare Bitter Triumph in this situation, an unfair card that's great for Reanimator, but kind of middling for a slower list like this. Now, yes, it's a removal spell. That's just generically good. But the discarding as an additional cost to put a Spore Frog in the graveyard, then return it on your upkeep with this Oversold Cemetery, is saving you 3 life on that additional cost. Like, the Spore Frog was already in your hand and you could have just played it and sacked it instead. Whereas in Reanimator, it's a way to set up a turn 3 Valgavoth or something. In fact, something like a Shriekmaw or Cursed Marauder would probably do better work here than a Bitter Triumph. A removal spell that can be recurred by your value engines like Six. If you really need discard outlets, you would probably favor something like Tortured Existence, which can be a lot more grindy, as opposed to a one-off effect like this. Now, this isn't a one-size-fits-all heuristics. Lands, despite often being built as an unfair combo deck, will often run self-mill cards. Like, yeah, Lumra and Aftermath Analysts are there to mill you a little, but those are more for the return everything and win the game on the spot effect, rather than the self-mill. I'm talking more like Hedron Crab to target yourself with, or Malevolent Rumble. Even then, lands gamers will often run Zurin Orb or Sylvan Safekeeper that they can get with Green Sun Zenith to get the lands unstranded from the battlefield and into the graveyard where they can do Amulet of Vigor BS or whatever. Storm is another one of these decks you shouldn't really be worried about either, since instants and sorceries go to the graveyard by themselves without needing any help by discard, sacrifice outlets, or milling. Like, yeah, combo lines for Underworld Breach uses Brain Freeze to self-mill for a win, or you can maybe run like an Ancient Excavation to set up a big Mystics Mastery with giant spells, but generally speaking, you don't have to worry about it all too much when the spells you want to recur go to the graveyard for you. Basically, in general here, think about the fail case for your strategy. Where are cards getting stuck? What is the power level of the card you're bringing back? If you get uncastables with high card quality stuck in hand, discards or entombs will probably be your best route to victory over self-mill. If it's more of a quantity over quality game though, self-mill is probably more your route. Sometimes though, the answer is neither, because you have no issues getting your cards where they need to go. Speaking of fail cases though, Graveyard Hate exists and still kills you on contact. So let's talk about how to maybe counteract these sorts of cards, because they are counterable, generally speaking. Starting with, yes, they are actually literally counterable. The best way to deal with a Grave Hate spell is to counterspell it, because once they are put into play, you won't be able to abrade a Soul Guide Lantern or what have you. The benefit of countering too is you get spells like Spider Sense that can counter a slew of different Graveyard Hate non-creature spells, but also can counter the trigger of a Bojuka Bog or what have you. Great news for non-blue players though, there are more options for negating Graveyard Hate. In white, Teferi's protection gives you protection from everything, so it makes Yard Hate that is targeted fizzle. And herein lies a way that Dawn's Truce is stronger than Heroic Intervention, since it gives you hexproof in addition to your board, which acts in much the same way. For a more discard-focused strategy, you can lean on one of the best cards to ever do it, Currency Converter. This is such a silly card that gives you lots of value, but a lot of people don't think of it as graveyard protection. Put your giant monster under it with the discard spell, and now you don't have to put it into your graveyard with the tap ability until you're 100% ready to reanimate it. Very annoying stuff there. Finally, something like a Clarion Conqueror or a Collector Oof in a deck when it doesn't friendly fire you, because a lot of the Graveyard Hate out there is on artifacts. If you're more of a fair graveyard deck though, I generally wouldn't worry about running much, if at all, graveyard protection like this though. This is because if you establish a strong board of repeatable self-mill engines like Sivirus, Six, or what have you, you'll be able to rebuild easily, since you're not putting all of your eggs into one giant unfair basket. You should probably only worry about packing some amount of generic any permanent removal so you don't get yourself pinned under persistent yard hate like Rest in Peace or Douthy Voidwalker. Even then, it's not like unfair decks really need yard protection most of the time either. Often, a lot of graveyard hate can be played around by good play sequencing. Like, oh, I'm playing Storm, nice Bazooka Bog there, let me go Ritual, Card Advantage, Ritual, Ritual, Card Advantage from hand with my cost reducer out, and then cast my Past in Flames and get those back right away to combo off. Nice yard hate, chuckle nuts. Or, with Reanimator, just banking your discard spell until you can reanimate the same turn if you read that something is amiss with your opponent's play patterns that might suggest a more staggered discard your giant loser, pass, then reanimate them on the next turn line would be in danger. This wouldn't be much of a graveyard video if I didn't talk more in depth about graveyard hate here, so let's do that. Not only for you dirty graveyard players to learn how to counteract it in the forms that it will appear, but to give y'all non-graveyard players options to run to hose your friends. Honestly, graveyard discard synergy should be taken about as seriously as you would planeswalkers or enchantments. Like, not super required to build around removing them or anything like that, but most playgroups should lead you to have maybe a couple answers kicking around your deck that are flexible enough to not be dead draws. You're really spoiled for choice now, to the point where it's kind of just irresponsible for most decks to not have like 1 to 3 nuclear yard buttons. Already mentioned, I want to first talk about artifact-based graveyard hate. These are actually really good most of the time due to their ability to be held up after being played early, and most of them have a mode to cycle themselves if they're not being useful. With the abundance of cards like Trinket Mage and Urza Saga and Tezzeret, Cruel Captain, and etc. that tutor for small artifacts, as well as cards that just get any artifact, these are extra at home in decks that have a lot of synergy, but realistically, they are just generically good cards to run, especially if you have some graveyard trickery of your own, like Six or Lurrus or Glissa, that can loop the graveyard hate rock over and over just for the cantripping. Or maybe for something like Delirium. It's an artifact, that's a different card type. Anyway, long story short, a Soul Guide Lantern or something of its like is always a safe option if you don't know what else to grab but want to start killing Johnny Gravehands. Next, I want to recommend a couple of instant speed options that I love dearly. Blessed Respite and Thraben Charm. These cards are killer in both their graveyard hate and other uses, with Blessed Respite being a good option in any deck that is hankering for a fog. In fact, it's often my first choice for such a thing, and Thraben Charm being a premier removal spell. I've had people say that they're scared of it being dead, but since it does damage equal to twice the number of creatures you control, if you're running like a 27 creature or more deck, you'll often have this at a point where it will just kill what you need it to. Bazooka Bog is often considered the GOAT when it comes to land-based yard hate, but I don't find myself running it in a lot of my black decks unless I have a way to make it instant speed, like with a White of the Reliquary, Urza's Cave, or Crop Rotation. I often prefer Bogart Trawler in its spot, since it can enter untapped as a land, and it's a creature for any deck that cares about looping those. Though, it's not a bad idea to run both. They are just both kinda good, even if devoid of synergy. I have been partial to Scavenger Grounds recently though. It's nice it hits everyone, yes, but it being a desert is especially sick after the arrival of Sand Scout back in OTJ Commander, where you can tutor it up. It's just super sick. Legitimately, if you're not on Sand Scout yet, it's super good. Speaking of creatures that are really good, Selfless Spirit yard hate creatures have to be some of my favorites. Douthy Voidwalker is even more annoying, and a card like Kutzel's Flanker could be good for a Flicker deck as like a C-tier Flicker target that also kills a graveyard player when needed. It's funny how with all these grave hate spells, most of them are cheap permanents that sacrifice themselves to grave hate, which makes them repeatable with Lurrus or Six, so that makes some of the best grave hating done by graveyard decks. I mean, Valgavoth is literally the king of graveyard haters. He's literally a big Douthy Voidwalker, so I guess this isn't a big surprise. That does it for this video though. Let me know if this helped give you some ideas for what is wrong with your graveyard deck, or if it gave you some good ideas for how to include a little more graveyard hate in your decks. What graveyard decks do you run, and what's your spicy tech for them? Let me know down in the comments below, and until next time, bye!